Some men get humiliated in private. A quiet argument behind closed doors, a cold shoulder at the dinner table, the kind of pain that dies with you. Me? Paul Banks handed me a dollar bill in front of 47 people and told me he'd take good care of my wife tonight. I counted. 47. I'd remember every single face. Welcome back to Dad's True Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, and be sure to subscribe. You're going to love it here. It started the way most disasters do, with good intentions and an ironed shirt. Barbara had been on my case about socializing for months. Nicholas, we never go out anymore. Nicholas, you work too much. Nicholas, Joe, and Sonia invited us, and it would be rude not to go. So on a warm Sunday evening in late October, I put on my navy blazer, drove us 40 minutes from Cedar Park to Westlake Hills, and walked into Joe Lawson's estate with my wife on my arm, and absolutely zero idea that I was walking into the last night of my marriage. Joe Lawson's house wasn't a house. It was a statement. 12-foot hedges lining the driveway, a fountain that probably cost more than my first car. Valets in matching vests taking keys from men who hadn't opened their own doors in years. I handed my keys to a kid who looked at my 2019 Tahoe the way you look at a dog that wandered into a steakhouse. Nice party, I said to Barbara as we walked through the front doors. Don't embarrass me, she said. That should have been my first sign. Sonia Lawson met us at the entrance, glittering in a gold dress that was fighting a losing battle with gravity. She kissed Barbara on both cheeks like they were in Paris, then shook my hand like I was the cable guy who'd shown up on time for once. Pleasant surprise, still not quite welcome. Nicholas, so glad you made it. Joe's somewhere near the bar, obviously. She laughed. I laughed. We all laughed. Nobody meant any of it. Joe found me 20 minutes later, bourbon in hand, and slapped me on the back hard enough to spill half of it onto his own shoes. Classic Joe. Burns. You actually came. Barbara finally dragged you out of that cave? Kicking and screaming, I said. Joe Lawson was a good man. Loud, generous, the kind of guy who'd give you the shirt off his back and then spend 45 minutes telling the story of how he gave you the shirt off his back. We'd known each other 6 years, met through a mutual fund conference in Dallas. He knew vaguely what I did for a living. Most people at this party didn't, because I didn't talk about it at parties. Barbara always said I was too private. I called it strategic. I didn't know it yet, but that strategy was the only thing that would save me. I spotted Paul Banks at 8:14 p.m. I know the exact time because I'd just checked my phone. A text from Damian Wesley back at the domain office, asking about a filing deadline that couldn't wait until Monday, apparently. Because Damian has the patience of a golden retriever and the urgency of a man who's always on fire about something. I was typing back, "It can wait, Damian, it's Sunday," when I heard Barbara laugh. Not her polite laugh, not her company's here laugh, her real laugh. I looked up. He was standing near the fireplace like he'd been placed there by a film director who'd run out of subtlety. Tall, tanned, the kind of tan you get from owning a boat rather than painting a fence. Salt and pepper hair that cost more to maintain than my monthly grocery bill. A watch on his wrist that whispered 7 figures if you knew what you were looking at. I knew what I was looking at. Barbara was looking at him like she'd forgotten I existed. Like I was a piece of furniture she'd stopped noticing years ago. Useful once, now just in the way. I kept my face completely still. I was very good at that. "Who's that?" I asked Joe, who'd materialized at my elbow with a fresh bourbon and the energy of a man who had nowhere better to be. Paul Banks. Joe said it the way people say LeBron James, like the name alone should do something to you. Tech exits, venture capital, the whole rodeo. Sold his last company for something north of $800 million. Moved to Austin 2 years ago. Got a penthouse at the W downtown. He paused, then added with a shrug, "Good guy. Little flashy." Little flashy. The man had cufflinks that were probably individually insured. I watched Barbara drift toward him the way water finds a drain, naturally, inevitably, like physics had already decided for her. Sonia made the introduction. Paul Banks smiled, and it was the smile of a man who has never once in his adult life worried about a car payment or a Sunday night text about filing deadlines. I went and got a drink, a strong one. By 9 p.m., Barbara had stopped looping back to check on me between conversations. By 9:30, she and Paul were tucked into a corner by the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Austin skyline glittering behind them like a backdrop someone had ordered specifically to make Paul Banks look more impressive. By 9:45, I was standing with Joe and two men I'd just met, a orthodontist from Round Rock, and a guy who kept saying, "in this economy after everything," and I could feel it. That specific stomach-dropping awareness that your marriage is changing shape in real time across a crowded room, like watching a building lean. Nobody else sees it, but you feel it in your feet. Damien would have told me to walk over there. "Nick, stop marinating, man. You let everything marinate too long. Some things ain't supposed to marinate." He said that to me once about a business deal, and he was right. He said it to me once about leftover shrimp, and he was also right. But Damien wasn't here, and I was patient for a reason. I didn't know it yet, but that patience was about to be tested in ways I hadn't fully prepared for. I excused myself from In This Economy guy and drifted toward the bar. And that's when the evening shattered into pieces I'd spend the next 72 hours putting back together, sharper than before. I was passing the fireplace when Paul Banks stepped directly into my path. He didn't stumble into me, didn't drift. He stepped, the way men like him do everything, like the world rearranges itself around their intentions, because it always has. "You're Barbara's husband." Not a question, a verdict. The man had already tried and sentenced me in whatever internal court he ran. "Nicholas Burns," I said, and extended my hand. He looked at it for a half-second too long before shaking it. His grip was the kind men practice in mirrors. "Paul Banks." The smile again. Smooth. Rehearsed. "She's mentioned you. Good things, I hope. She said you work a lot." He swirled his glass like a man who'd taken a class on swirling glasses. "Finance something like that," I said. I always said that. Barbara appeared at his elbow right on cue, like she'd been waiting just off stage. There was color in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the wine, and everything to do with the company. She looked at Paul the way she used to look at me, back when we were young, and I was still a mystery worth solving. I noticed. I filed it away. I kept smiling. "Nicholas," the way she said my name, flat, almost apologetic, like I was a notification she'd been ignoring and I'd finally popped up on screen. "Hey, Barb." Big smile. Warm. Unbothered. I was none of those things. "Paul was just telling me about the views from his place downtown," she said, her voice doing that breathy thing it did when she was genuinely excited. "Apparently on a clear night you can see all the way to the hill country." Paul Banks looked back at me, and something shifted behind his eyes. A small, quiet calculation, the kind rich men make when they've decided you're not a threat. You're not a peer, you're just furniture that happens to be standing between them and what they want. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, pulled out a wallet, slim black, the kind they sell in boutiques that don't put prices on anything because if you need to see the price, you're already in the wrong boutique. He produced a $1 bill, and he held it out to me. The nearest conversations dropped half a volume. Not the whole room, but enough. Enough for 47 people to catch the edges of what was happening. "For the valet," Paul said pleasantly. Then the smile, slow, deliberate, performed for the audience he knew he had. "Don't worry about Barbara tonight, friend. I'll take good care of her." The word friend landed like a shovel. I looked at the dollar. I looked at Barbara. She was looking at her shoes. 12 years of marriage, and she was staring at her shoes like they contained the answers to questions she didn't want to ask. That was the moment. Not the dollar. Not Paul Banks and his boat tan and his boutique wallet. It was Barbara, looking at her shoes. I took the dollar. Slowly. Deliberately. I folded it once, crisp and neat, like it was a document I intended to keep, tucked it into my breast pocket, and smoothed my jacket flat. "Thank you, Paul," I said. Quiet. Calm. The kind of calm that only comes from deciding something final. "I'll hold on to that." I shook his hand. Firm. Unhurried. I nodded at my wife, and I walked to the valet stand without looking back. Not once. 40 minutes back to Cedar Park. No music. No podcast. Just the hum of I-35 and the sound of my own mind running calculations that would have impressed people who knew what I did for a living. I pulled into the driveway on Millbrook Lane at 11:02 p.m., sat in the car. The garage light was on. Barbara always set it on a timer. One of her small domestic faithfuls that had outlasted apparently her faithfulness in other departments. I made 3 phone calls sitting in that car. The first was to Damien Wesley. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was still awake, which meant he'd been waiting to hear how the party went, which meant he knew Barbara better than he'd ever said out loud. "You're calling me from a party?" he said. "I left the party. Beat. Where's Barbara?" Still there. Longer beat. The kind that means someone is doing math. Nick, I need you at the Domain. 7 a.m. Bring coffee. Real coffee, not that oat milk situation you've been doing. I paused, and pull the file I sent you in March. The one I told you to hold and not ask me about. Dead silence. Then quietly, "Oh." "Yeah," I said. "Oh." The second call was to my attorney, Gerald Marsh. At 11:08 on a Sunday night, he picked up on the third ring, because that's what I pay him for, and Gerald Marsh has never once in 20 years made me feel like I was calling at a bad time. God bless Gerald Marsh. The third call, I'm not ready to tell you about the third call yet, but it was the one that would make Paul Banks' stomach drop through the floor of his $800 million life. I sat in my car for 11 more minutes after that, just me in the dark and the folded dollar bill sitting in my breast pocket, like a tiny, beautiful piece of ammunition. Paul Banks thought he was tipping the help. He'd actually just handed me the first move in a game he didn't know we were playing. I went inside, poured 2 fingers of Blanton's, sat at the kitchen table under the light Barbara picked out at that Home Goods in Round Rock 3 years ago, the one we argued about for 20 minutes, because I thought it was too big and she was right, it wasn't, and I stayed there until 2 a.m., building, planning. Barbara Burns would come home Monday morning to find her key didn't fit the door, and Paul Banks, $800 million, penthouse views, boat tan and all, would make a phone call that would ruin what was left of his Sunday morning. Neither of them had any idea who Nicholas Burns actually was. They were about to get a very expensive education. There's a specific kind of Monday morning that exists only for people who've made a decision they can't unmake. The coffee tastes different. The light comes in different. The silence in a house that used to have another person in it lands different. I made my coffee at 5:47 a.m., and it tasted like clarity. Barbara had texted at 1:23 a.m. I know because my phone lit up the kitchen ceiling while I was still at the table. I didn't read it until morning. The text said, "Staying at Sonia's tonight, we need to talk tomorrow." I read it once, put my phone face down on the counter, finished my coffee. Staying at Sonia's. Sure she was. Here's the thing about lies, and I say this as a man who has spent 15 years in private equity, where lying is essentially a contact sport with better tailoring. The worst ones aren't the elaborate ones. The worst ones are the lazy ones, the ones people tell when they think you're too distracted, too trusting, or too small to investigate. Barbara thought I was all three. She was about to update her assumptions. I showered, put on my charcoal Loro Piana suit, the one I wore to closings, the one Damien called my somebody's about to have a bad day suit, and I drove to the Domain at 6:30 a.m., with one stop on the way. I had a locksmith meet me at the house on Nilbrook Lane at 6:15. His name was Terry. Terry was punctual, professional, and blessedly uninterested in why a man in a Loro Piana suit needed every lock in his house changed at dawn on a Monday. He just changed them, all 5, including the garage keypad code. "New keys?" Terry asked, holding up the fresh set. "Just the one set," I said. Terry nodded like he'd seen this before. He probably had. I tipped him $40. Folded. Neat. I was in a generous mood. Damien Wesley was already at the Domain office when I arrived at 7:02 a.m., which told me everything about how seriously he'd taken my phone call last night. Damien was a man who believed that arriving before 9 a.m. was a form of violence against himself. The fact that he was sitting in my office with 2 coffees and a manila folder at 7 in the morning meant he hadn't slept. "You look terrible," I said. "You look like you're about to foreclose on someone's soul," he said, pushing a coffee toward me. "So I guess we're both having a morning." I sat down. He slid the manila folder across the desk without me asking. I opened it. 15 pages. Single-spaced. 18 months of quiet, careful, completely legal research that I'd commissioned in April and told Damien to hold until I needed it or until I was wrong. I hadn't been wrong. "How bad?" Damien asked. I turned to page 4, then page 9, then the last page, where Gerald Marsh's preliminary notes were paper-clipped to a summary that would have made Paul Banks swallow his boutique wallet whole. "Remember when Paul Banks sold his company for $800 million?" I said. "Yeah. Guess who his primary institutional investor was for the last 3 rounds of funding?" Damien stared at me. I let him stare. I was enjoying this more than I should have. "No," he said. "Page 9, I said. He grabbed the folder, flipped to page 9, read for about 12 seconds. Then he put the folder down very slowly, the way you put something down when your hands have stopped working properly. "Nick," he said, You've been his bank this whole time. Through 2 shells and a Luxembourg holding company, because I'm not an animal. I sipped my coffee. But yes, effectively. Me. Damien sat back in his chair and laughed. Not a funny laugh. This is either genius or insane laugh that bounced off my office walls and probably confused Janet Cooper out in the hallway. He threw $1 at you, Damien said. He did. And you're his bank. I am. Nick. He pressed both hands flat on my desk. Does he know? Paul Banks knows his investors through a fund administrator in Luxembourg named Claude Berger, who communicates exclusively by encrypted email and has never once mentioned the name Nicholas Burns. I straightened my jacket. So no. He does not know. He didn't know yet. But Monday was young. Gerald Marsh arrived at 8:30 a.m., with his reading glasses on his head and his litigation face fully assembled. Gerald was 61, built like a former linebacker who discovered good suits, and he had the quiet energy of a man who had never lost a negotiation he cared about. He shook my hand, sat down, opened his own folder and said, "Tell me everything." So I did. I told him about the party, the corner by the window, the wallet, the dollar bill, slow and deliberate, in front of 47 people. I told him about Barbara's shoes and the text from Sonia's, and the way Paul Banks had smiled at me like I was a coat check ticket he didn't need to keep. Gerald listened without interrupting, which was how I knew it was serious. Gerald interrupted everybody. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The dollar bill is in your possession, breast pocket of my navy blazer, folded once." He nodded slowly. "And your marriage, had you previously documented any concerns?" "Gerald," I said, "I'm a private equity investor. I documented everything. I've documented concerns since February." He almost smiled. "Of course you have," he made a note. "All right, here's where we are. What Gerald told me next I'll keep between us for now. But I will say this. By the time he left my office at 10:15 a.m., Paul Banks's $800 million life had a crack in it so fine he couldn't see it yet. He'd feel it soon enough. At 10:47 a.m. my phone rang. Barbara. I let it ring 3 times, not because I was dramatic, but because I was finishing a sentence in an email that was considerably more important than this conversation was going to be. Then I answered. "Nicholas." Her voice was careful, pre-rehearsed. She'd planned this call. I could always tell when Barbara planned a conversation, because she started with my full name and a 1-beat pause, like she was reading from a teleprompter only she could see. "Barbara," I said, same energy. Let her work for it. "We need to talk." "We do," I agreed pleasantly. "I'm going to come home this afternoon and—" "Ah," I said, "about that." Pause. "What?" "You might want to call a locksmith before you make the drive from Cedar Park," I said. "Actually, you probably want to call a locksmith, a real estate attorney, and whoever you've been actually staying with. In that order." The silence on the other end of the line was so complete I could hear her breathing recalibrate. "What did you do, Nicholas?" Not a question. A detonation. "I changed the locks on my house, Barbara. Still pleasant, still unbothered, still absolutely bothered, but she would never know that. It's in my name. Has been since 2019. You might recall the refinance. You were in Sedona with Sonia on a spa trip. You signed the documents electronically." I paused. "Gerald says hi, by the way." "You called Gerald." Her voice cracked up an octave. "Last night?" "He's very responsive," I said. "It's why I pay him." "Nicholas, this is insane. You can't just—" "I'll have Damien coordinate with your sister about collecting your things," I said. "Take whatever you'd like from the house. Except the home goods light fixture in the kitchen. That one's mine." I was right about the size, actually. It's perfect in there. I hung up. I sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I allowed myself exactly 1 fist on the desk. Just one. A man has to have limits. At 2:30 p.m., Damien knocked on my office door, walked in, and sat down with the expression of someone who had witnessed a car accident and couldn't decide if it was tragic or spectacular. "She called me," he said. I figured. "What'd you say?" "First call, I said I was in a meeting." He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers. "Second call, I said I was still in a meeting." "Good man." "Nick." He set the pen down. She sounded... He stopped. Reconsidered. "She's scared." I looked out the window at the domain's courtyard below. A woman was walking a dog the size of a small sofa. A couple was eating lunch at an outdoor table, laughing about something. Regular Monday. Regular lives, I'd had a regular life yesterday. I know, I said quietly. And here's the thing, and I need you to understand this about me. I wasn't happy. Not really. There's no version of your wife choosing a man with a better watch over you that feels like winning. No amount of legal preparation, no manila folder, no Loro Piana suit patches over the specific bruise of watching someone you loved look at her shoes because she couldn't look at you. But I was a man with a plan, and the plan wasn't finished. The third call, Damien said, the one you made last night that you won't tell me about. He looked at me steadily. When does that part happen? I checked my watch. About. I started. My office phone rang. The line that only 6 people in the world had the number to. I looked at the caller ID. Luxembourg area code. Claude Berger. I looked at Damien. He looked at me. Now, I said. That part happens now. I picked up the phone. Here's what Paul Banks' Monday had looked like I would later piece together from sources I won't name yet. He'd woken up at his penthouse at the W sometime around 9. Because men like Paul Banks don't set alarms. The morning just waits for them politely. He'd had his coffee. He'd probably admired the hill country view he'd been so eager to describe to my wife. He'd checked his portfolio, his messages, whatever Paul Banks checked on a regular Monday morning. And then, at precisely 11:03 a.m., his fund administrator in Luxembourg, a man named Claude Berger who communicated exclusively by encrypted email and had never once mentioned the name Nicholas Burns, had sent him a message, 14 lines. I know exactly what those 14 lines said, because I drafted them myself at 1:37 a.m., sitting at my kitchen table under Barbara's home goods light. I'll tell you what they said in a moment. First, let me tell you what Paul Banks did when he read them. Because Janet Cooper, my assistant, who had connections in places I'd cultivated carefully over years for reasons exactly like this, told me later that Paul Banks had called his own attorney 4 times between 11:15 and noon. 4 times. In 45 minutes. A man who threw dollar bills at strangers, calling his lawyer 4 times before lunchtime on a Monday. I want you to sit with that image for a second. The 14 lines informed Paul Banks that his primary institutional funding partner was exercising a contractual right, buried in Section 1400, of an agreement Paul had signed 3 years ago in a conference room in Austin, without reading carefully enough, to conduct an immediate audit of all assets tied to the fund. Not a hostile action, not a seizure, just an audit, a very thorough, very inconvenient, very public audit, the kind that makes other investors nervous, the kind that makes banks ask questions, the kind that, in the venture capital world, is the equivalent of someone standing up in a crowded restaurant and saying, does anyone know if this place passed its last health inspection? Technically harmless, functionally devastating. Paul Banks had 7 active deals in various stages of closing. By 2 p.m. Monday, 3 of them had made calls expressing concern. He didn't know it yet, but by Tuesday morning, the number would be 5. And he still had no idea who was on the other end of that Luxembourg email address. At 4:45 p.m., Barbara called Damien a 3rd time. Damien, God love him, was still in a meeting. At 5:15 p.m., she called my cell. I was in the car, heading back to Cedar Park, to my house with my new locks and my kitchen light, and I let it ring to voicemail. She left 48 seconds. I timed it. The first 30 seconds were angry. The last 18 were something else. Something quieter. Something that almost sounded like the Barbara I'd married in a small church in Georgetown, Texas on a Saturday in June, 12 years ago, when she'd cried before I even finished my vows and I'd thought, this woman is going to love me forever. Turns out, forever had an asterisk. I deleted the voicemail. I pulled into my driveway on Millbrook Lane, sat in my car, and I looked at my house. Then I reached into my blazer pocket, and I took out that folded dollar bill and I held it in the last of the October light coming through my windshield. Paul Banks' fingerprints were on this thing. So was my marriage. So was everything that came next. I put it back in my pocket, went inside, and poured the Blantons. Tomorrow was Tuesday. Paul Banks was going to call Barbara screaming, and what he was going to say, I'd waited 24 hours for this, was going to change everything. Tuesday started the way all consequential days do. Quietly. No fanfare. No trembling earth. Just my 5:47 a.m. coffee and the particular stillness of a house that has been emptied of a lie. The kitchen felt bigger somehow. Rooms do that when you remove something that was taking up space. Not physical space, but the other kind. The kind you don't notice until it's gone and you can finally breathe all the way in. Paul Banks called at 9:11 a.m. I let it go to voicemail. 41 seconds. Short. For a man unraveling. This is Paul Banks. I need to speak with Nicholas Burns. Directly. It's urgent. Please. From the man who'd handed me a dollar bill in front of 47 people like I was the coat check with a cash-only policy. I played it twice. Poured a second coffee. Then I called Gerald. He left a voicemail. I said, "I know," Gerald said. His attorney called mine at 8:45. They want to meet. I looked at the dollar bill sitting flat on my kitchen table. Unfolded now, centered. Catching the morning light like a relic someone had framed and forgotten to hang. Thursday, I said. My office. 10 a.m. And Gerald, make sure his attorney hears the name clearly. Burns Capital Partners. The silence on his end was the sound of a man doing very controlled laughing. Consider it done, he said. Barbara called at noon. I answered this time. She deserved that much. Nicholas. Her voice was careful, stripped of its rehearsal. This was something rawer, something that cost her something to dial. Hey, Barb. A long pause, the kind that carries 12 years in it. I made a mistake, she said. Not I'm sorry. Not it didn't mean anything. Just the plain undecorated truth offered quietly, like she knew decoration wasn't going to help her now. I sat with that for a moment. The honest version of Barbara, the one from the small church in Georgetown, the one who'd cried before I finished my vows. That version still lived somewhere inside the woman who'd stared at her shoes on Sunday night while a man handed her husband a dollar bill. I'd spent 3 days deciding what to do with that knowledge. I know you did, I said. Nick, the house in Sedona is in your name, I said. Has been for 2 years. You picked it out, remember? That weekend, I supposedly had a conference in Phoenix. She'd thought I was working. I'd been at a title company signing documents. It's yours. Gerald will handle everything else. You'll be fine, Barbara. Better than fine. After what I did, because you were my wife for 12 years, I said. That means something, even now. Especially now, I paused. It just doesn't mean what it used to. I heard her breath catch. Not dramatically, just the small sound a person makes when they receive something they know they don't deserve and don't know what to do with the weight of it. I'm sorry, Nicholas, she said, and this time I believed her. Too late is still true. I know, I said. Take care of yourself, Barb. I hung up, sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then I allowed myself exactly one fist on the table. Just one. A man has to have limits. What happened between Tuesday and Thursday is best understood as a physics problem. When you are Paul Banks, $800 million, penthouse views, the specific confidence of someone who has never once in his adult life had a door close in his face, you operate on assumptions. The assumptions are load-bearing. Remove one, and the structure doesn't just crack. It teaches you in real time what it was always made of. By Wednesday afternoon, 5 of his 7 active deals had gone quiet. His bank, the serious one, not the boutique one handling the penthouse mortgage, had requested a conversation. The conversation was about exposure. Exposure, a word Paul Banks was not accustomed to hearing in reference to himself. Damien texted me Wednesday evening. 5 deals. You were right about all of it. Barbara called my cell from what I assume is Paul's number. I remain, as always, in a meeting. I texted back, good man. Raise incoming. He walked into Burns Capital Partners at 9:57 a.m. Thursday. Still tanned, still wearing the watch, still moving, like a man who had never in his life waited for his own table. I'll give him that. Paul Banks had excellent posture for someone whose floor had quietly dropped 6 inches beneath him. His attorney, Colton Webb, Webb & Hargrove, Austin's preferred firm for men with newly expensive problems, was 2 steps behind, carrying the expression of someone who had read the file thoroughly and found the experience deeply unpleasant. Paul saw me and went very still, not dramatically, just still. The specific stillness of a man who has spent 48 hours revising his understanding of a situation and has just now seen the last piece click into place. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and extended my hand. Paul, I said pleasantly, good to see you again. He shook it. His grip was different this time. Less rehearsed, less mirror practiced, Mr. Burns, he said. Mr. Burns. Not friend. Not the half-second pause before he deigned to shake my hand. Not the smile performed for a crowd that wasn't here anymore. We sat. Colton Webb opened his leather portfolio and began talking about paths to resolution. I let him talk. I was watching Paul Banks look slowly around my conference room. The view of the domain below, the framed documents on the wall, Janet Cooper's quiet efficiency beyond the glass, the specific gravity of a room where serious decisions are made by people nobody thinks to underestimate twice, and I watched understanding arrive on his face, the way weather arrives. Gradually, then all at once. I reached into my jacket pocket. I placed the dollar bill on the table between us, folded once, crisp and neat, exactly as he'd left it with me Sunday night, in front of 47 people who would, I suspected, be dining out on that story for considerably less time than they'd planned. "I believe that's yours," I said. "You left it with me Sunday." The silence that followed was the most expensive silence I have ever sat inside, considerably more than $1's worth. Then Gerald and I spent 45 minutes walking Paul Banks through the contractual reality of his life, methodically, without theater, without pleasure, the way you do a job you've prepared for carefully and hoped you'd never have to use. The audit would close on our timeline. His deals would survive. His bank would settle. Everything was going to be perfectly, immaculately fine. He would simply spend the next 90 days understanding in careful detail who had been his money for the past 3 years. A man who reads rooms the way Paul Banks read that party, as backdrop, as furniture arranged for his convenience, tends not to read documents carefully enough. Section 14 has a way of clarifying that habit. He sat across from me for 45 minutes and said almost nothing. It was genuinely the most sophisticated thing he'd done all week. At the door, he stopped. He turned. Looked at me the way you look at something you walked past 100 times without seeing. "I didn't know who you were," he said. "I know," I said. That was rather the point. A pause. Something moved across his face. Not quite remorse. Not quite respect. The specific expression of a man who has located too late the exact place where he went wrong. "The dollar," he said quietly. "The dollar," I agreed. He nodded once. Small, clean, the dignified acknowledgement of a man who has correctly identified checkmate and has enough class left to tip his king without being asked, and walked out. I stood at the window for a long time after that, watched the courtyard below, the woman with the dog, the couple laughing over lunch, regular lives moving through a regular Thursday, completely unaware that anything had shifted. I reached into my pocket, took out the dollar bill, held it in the afternoon light coming through the glass. Paul Banks had thought he was tipping the help. He'd handed me the first move in a game he didn't know we were playing, against a man he'd never once thought to look at carefully. The most expensive mistake you can make, in business, in life, at a party in Westlake Hills on a warm Sunday in October, is to look at a quiet man and see nothing worth worrying about. I thought about the church in Georgetown, Barbara's tears before I finished my vows, 12 years of a life that had ended in a woman staring at her shoes. I thought about the Sedona house, the way she'd said I'm sorry and meant it. Finally, after it was too late to matter and too true to dismiss, I folded the dollar bill, slid it back into my pocket. Some things you keep, not as trophies, not as wounds, just as proof that you were there, that it happened, that you handled it with both hands and walked out of the room on your own 2 feet, and didn't look back. Not once. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of this sphere.